I would like to introduce you to Jane Katz. Jane is Director of International Affairs and Programs in Habitat for Humanity in their international Washington, D.C. office of Government Relations and Advocacy, where she develops housing policy positions and promotes advocacy issues on Habitat's international policy priorities. She manages the Global Housing Indicators Initiative and represents Habitat for Humanity International on international coalitions and advisory groups on land, housing policy, gender, disaster risk reduction, and even urban issues. Before coming to Habitat, Jane spent 14 years at Fannie Mae in various management positions and 15 years in the U.S. public sector in mortgage finance, regulatory oversight, and housing policy at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress. So welcome, Jane Katz.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You are a fellow in the Academy of Housing and Communities. And being a fellow means that you have forged public policy and the direction of housing and communities. So talk a little bit about your role, for instance, in the three areas that you mentioned, or the three public service jobs you had. Talk a little bit about all the things that you've done.
Sure.
And what's some of your history?
Okay, sure. I guess I'll start at the beginning. I studied international development was really where I started. And I came to Washington, with bright ideas and things about going into international service or something along those lines, and hit a roadblock. I couldn't find a job. So it just happened that I was having coffee with someone at the Library of Congress, and they said, "Oh, there's an economic division here at the Library of Congress. Do you have any economics background?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I took a course in comparative economic systems and intro to econ." "Oh, that's great." So I had an interview in the economics division, and it turned out that I was assigned to somebody who really was a housing senior specialist, Henry Schechter, who had worked under Weaver and had real history with housing. I knew nothing about housing. I didn't know what housing was really or anything about it. And so that was sort of the start of the learning that I had to go through initially to work on different areas in housing. I was an economic analyst for a while in housing. So that meant I really needed to learn about housing. I went back to grad school while I was at the Library of Congress, which was really great because they paid for it. And then also had a chance to visit some of the housing projects where we were studying. We were studying subsidized housing, we were studying housing for the elderly, and various other pieces. And I had a tiny bit of work that was related to housing finance. So that's where I started. But after I graduated from grad school, I took a position as a consultant for a now distinct Arthur Young and Company, which is Ernst & Young now. And they assigned me to programs working at HUD, worked on economic analysis and productivity in policy development and research. But while I was there, I also got to meet some of the people who were working there, and they said, "Oh, you worked for Henry Schechter. Oh, you need to come to work with us here at HUD." And so I ended up really in the housing finance more specifically. What I did was I worked on issues around mortgage markets and capital markets and oversight over Fannie Mae. And that was sort of the beginning of working and specializing in housing finance while I was at HUD. I can keep going. But I spent about 6 years at HUD. I worked on a number of interagency task forces. I was just looking back to see that I was on Regulation Q and the issues around disintermediation, and working on oversight and capital markets reports. And some of my reports went over to OMB. And it just happened that they were looking for somebody who had done oversight or knew something about the secondary mortgage market. And that's how I ended up over at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board after 6 years at HUD. And there's lots of stories at HUD, but I ended up in an economics division at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and ended up working on capital issues and a number of other issues. But it was really my first foray into real policy, because we were advising the chairman of the board on Freddie Mac issues, on FSLIC issues, savings and loan issues. And that was really an opportunity to learn about policy firsthand.
So tell me a couple of stories about HUD.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not going to tell you too many stories about HUD, really, but it was an interesting place to work. I worked with Larry Simon quite a bit, and worked on some of the mortgage market reports. We did do work on oversight of Fannie Mae, and I think that was something that I had, did a little bit of when I was at the Congressional Research Service, but I think that I did much more on trying to figure out the savings flows and things like that. So I worked, we were on a task force on the Consumer Cooperative Bank and other financial programmatic areas, where we were also overseeing new programs that Fannie Mae was doing. I think one of the things that where I did contribute was on this Regulation Q task force, where at the time FHA was adjusted, constantly being adjusted. And I think one of the outcomes of that effort was to really deregulate and to have a market-based FHA interest rate. So those were some of the things that I worked on at HUD.
So I've never heard of Regulation Q. What was that?
So it really had to do with, I think that it was a credit program where Congress was actually looking at trying to see what types of disintermediation or aspects of credit was going to be examined. And so that was one of the areas that it was really an interagency task force with a number of different players. I looked back to see that Jay Janis was on there, and a number of other former high-level officials were on this task force. And what we came out with really was to look at the credit markets and see how housing finance would be adjusted. And that was also because of ceilings at the time. There were regulated ceilings, which became market-based ceilings.
So how did you end up at the Habitat for Humanity?
So after I left the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and I went through a couple of different administrations at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and I think at one point I was saying, okay, maybe it's time to leave. It was just at a point where my kids were getting a little bit bigger. And when I first went to the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, really my consideration was family, having children. As I had been offered a position at Fannie Mae at one point, and decided, since they didn't have any childcare available and the Federal Home Loan Bank Board did, that was one of my reasons for going to the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. The person that I worked for, Eric Himmel, had just had a baby, and it was more conducive to my going there and not having to travel a lot at that time in my life. But after 5 years there, my child was older, my other two kids were older, and I was being tempted to go over to Fannie Mae. So I went to Fannie Mae and had a number of positions there. You see, I was there for like 14 years. But my real passion was to try to do international, which is where I started. I wanted to see how I might engage in international, and I had an opportunity to do an executive loan from Fannie Mae to a non-governmental organization, to a nonprofit. And my boss at the time said, "Oh, well, we think that Habitat for Humanity is doing international work. Do you want an interview over there?" And so I ended up going over to Habitat on an executive loan from Fannie Mae, and decided, yeah, I want to stay, because I started doing international work, which was my passion to start. So, and I could also, yeah, I was just going to say, I was able to combine the two, able to combine the housing work that I'd done, because it was a housing organization, with the international work, since I had an area of expertise.
Tell me a little bit about the executive loan program.
At the time, I think there were only a few each year, and I know that a couple of other people had done it. They had an opportunity uh, to work for a nonprofit organization for a year, where Fannie Mae would pay the salary. And so that was the only stipulation, is look for an organization that's a nonprofit that you want to contribute to. It was a few years after I went that a couple of other people that I know also engaged in the executive loan program. I think when Fannie Mae became under receivership a little bit, and had some other financial issues, that program really stopped. So it was a great opportunity for me, because I was able to get my salary from Fannie Mae and take a 50% cut if I was going to stay at Habitat, which I ended up doing. So
Tell me why you wanted to do the international work.
it was just something that I studied undergrad. When I first got out of college and started looking for a job, I looked in New York, working for the UN possibly, but I really ran into a roadblock in terms of opportunities for women without expertise. And so, I had a political science, foreign affairs degree, but I didn't have an area of expertise. And so that's where it helped, going back to school and getting something that was more targeted, like with housing and more economics, and developing more expertise in an area. So I just went down a different path instead of going the international path. Every once in a while I try to travel, but it wasn't the area that I had envisioned for myself when I first started.
So you now travel internationally,
Mhm.
serving with coalitions and advisory groups for the Habitat for Humanity group. So where are some of the places you've been, and what do you do when you go there?
Well, I think it's multiple things. First of all, Habitat works in over 70 countries, and the mission really of Habitat is to enable more people to have a decent place to live. So that's the housing piece, and I was able to bring that housing piece to some of the places where I work. And we have national organizations in about close to 70 countries now. So I would initially go out and visit some of the national organizations to see the type of work that they do. While I was at Habitat, they also underwent a transition to be an advocacy organization, and not just building houses one at a time, because we felt that, well, you're not going to reach so many people, 1.2 billion people who need housing internationally, by building a house for everybody. And by doing advocacy, we were able to really get the message out to prioritize housing. So where have I been? My early trips were to South Africa, to Nigeria, and I'd never been to Africa before when I first started out. I'd never been to South America, and I was in Paraguay last year in Asuncion. I've been to Costa Rica. Um, I've been to Asia now multiple times, to Nepal, and to Thailand, to Hong Kong, to Singapore. In some of those places, we've done conferences, and one of the partnerships that we developed was with United Nations Habitat, the Human Settlements Program. And I think this is where Kent and I sort of got off together, um, from the academy, in that we kind of met in preparation for one of the World Urban Forums that was taking place in Rio. And we did a whole series of programs around housing on the way to Rio, working with HUD, working with Rockefeller Foundation and others, to try to develop really housing policies that could be presented to an international audience. And so that was, the World Urban Forums take place every 2 years, and are put on by UN Habitat, which is the agency that covers human settlements. So that has been a priority every couple of years. And then this past 4 years, we've implemented our first global campaign, called Solid Ground. And one of the issues that we found that was really needed in order to be able to build houses was around secure tenure and land issues. Um, the cost of land being secure in your home so that you wouldn't be forced off the land by the government. And we created an advocacy campaign around that. And a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last few years has been to implement the campaign with partner organizations. We joined other groups to be able to work with them on land issues. And one of those groups is the Global Land Tool Network, which is an organization at UN Habitat that brings together over 80 different organizations to work on land issues together. So that was one of the things that we've been working on the past few years. Another kind of coalition that I've been working on is something called the General Assembly of Partners, and called GAP. And that's really to promote different issues at the UN. One of the things that we did do is promoted different issues for the New Urban Agenda, which is one of these global agreements that's signed by over 170 countries. And they agreed to examine the type of work that they're doing. And we were able to influence the outcome of the New Urban Agenda through our work in the General Assembly of Partners. I was able to get secure land tenure as one of the themes, and also able to succeed in working with the government to get housing finance as one of the key indicators in the document itself. Where housing finance wasn't included at all, we were able to do through some of the networking, getting housing finance as one of the established priorities. That's a
So
little bit.
what are some of your thoughts about public policy in the last 40, 50 years?
Well, I was taking a look back at some of the things that I worked on and said some things never change. I mean, sort of, you know, I was looking that I don't know, 20 years ago we were looking at regulatory barriers, and now the White House has an initiative on regulatory barriers. That doesn't change. Housing affordability, we're all still working on housing affordability, cost of housing. We have a US campaign with Habitat now called Cost of Home, and that's focusing on US housing issues, where we're trying to influence state government as well as federal government to improve housing and also reduce the cost of housing for people in this country. I think we weren't as spending a lot of time on homelessness, and that's a big area now that has grown. And I do see that there's a number of changes that have happened over the years that maybe we didn't focus enough attention to. And some of these are the climate change issues with disasters, the growing disasters that we are now really focusing on. And we've been working with HUD in Puerto Rico and various other places, but that seems to be one of the trends that's going to continue right on, right, and grow. And I won't even mention the health issues right now with the coronavirus. so.
What were some of your firsts in the industry? Did you plant some seeds someplace?
I was looking at some of the things that I did at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, where I worked on. I think some of those had to do with deregulation, but also more consumer regulation, that we were looking at, you know, how banks invest. I did a lot of work around high yield investments and mortgage-backed securities and junk bonds. And some of those things I think were, I looked back that one of my colleagues who was working at the Congressional Research Service cited something that we worked on junk bonds of high risk, and right before the collapse of the industry and the reorganizations. I guess I had my hand in a lot of the oversight of the Fannie and Freddie. I'm a little bit sad about what's going on with Fannie Mae these days, and hope I can continue to, you know, see some progress in financial institutions there as well. I think my contributions have been more on education and training for banks in some cases about how to do safe investing and safe safety, more capital requirements, and some of those things that I worked on quite a bit. So those are on the U.S. housing side, I think. I think more on the legacy will be on the more on the international side, which is what I've been really had passion to do lately, or the last number of years.
So on the Fannie side, what are some of the things that you're unhappy about that you think, and what kind of changes would you see?
Well, I like to see. I thought that I did work in the low and moderate income area housing impact division for a number of years, and we really did try to do right in terms of serving low and moderate income home buyers. We did try to reduce the costs for home buyers through a number of the programs that we developed. So I'm sorry to see that that some of those haven't really lasted in this new environment. I know they're making lots of money again and contributing to the treasury quite a bit, but I think we were really doing good work um, there that I'm sad about.
What are some of the roadblocks or challenges that you faced on the international scene?
On the international side, you're going to deal with, we're working on influencing governments to a large degree. So you have a number of governments that are really not happy about engaging with civil society or stakeholders or non-governmental organizations. I'll just put Russia up there and various other countries that don't want to see any influence of civil society, and civil society is where really a lot of the advocacy and the changes need to come from, and so I see a lot of challenges there. In terms of the work that we do, there's a lot of challenges in terms of trying to get tenure for people who live in these slum areas, and that's where we've done a lot of work lately on trying to improve the housing, but also the infrastructure with water and sanitation and electricity and various others. It's amazing if you go out to some of these settlements to see how people live, which is so different from the U.S. I know that there's poverty in the U.S., but if you walk through some of these slum areas and some of these developing countries, it's just amazing that they live that way they live.
Well, what do you think the future of affordable housing is? Let's take the United States first in the future.
Mhm. I guess one of the things that I'm hoping is that there'll be some technological developments in terms of the cost of housing. We're doing things now with different types of building materials. There's 3D printing. There's various other types of technology now that could be helpful in reducing the costs, at least the cost of materials. I do think the challenges still exist in the U.S. and internationally um, on the financing of housing and the cost of housing and bringing the costs down for more people. We're looking at different things in the U.S. and internationally on land value capture or different ways of financing using more ways of capturing taxes. But in a lot of these slum areas, they don't want to pay taxes. So that's an issue. So if you get an address, you you may still not want that address because then you'll be taxed. And so a lot of people in these informal settlements are happier producing livelihoods the way they work and not being considered citizens. So there's some issues around that.
We've talked to several guests on the podcast about 3D printing. What do you
Mm-hmm.
think some of the impediments to 3D printing are?
Having access to the machines. I know I've seen it done, but it takes a long time too. At least the ones that I've seen take a while to print. I just don't think it's caught on as it could. It takes a while. You need these big instruments and things, and I haven't seen it. I have seen it advertised and I have seen it demonstrated, but I'm not sure if that's going to be the answer.
Is
Yeah.
that something that you see as an investment opportunity, or is it just perhaps a risk?
I don't think it's caught on as much yet. I would wait to see who's doing it and what costs are involved. I haven't seen the costs really. But I have seen it demonstrated, like I think I was in Asia, in Hong Kong or something, went to a shopping center and they were demonstrating how they do it. But I haven't seen it really replicated a lot in this country. So.
You have been in many areas. If there was a life lesson that you could pass along to younger people that might be interested in government service or in general in what you're talking about, finance, housing, what would you tell them today?
I still think it's a terrific opportunity to do it. When I went to HUD originally, it was a really super place to learn. I think having that government experience really was really helpful for me in deciding later on, what direction to go. And I think public service is really a good thing to do. So I would still advise them. The other thing that I would advise is that if you hit roadblocks initially, which is what I did, that you keep pursuing what you're interested in. And maybe it doesn't turn out exactly how you think it's going to turn out, but the way it worked for me, it was like full circle. It took a long time, but I finally got to do what I wanted to do. And I'm very happy doing it.
Where do you
So.
think Habitat will be in 5 years?
Well, I'm hoping that they will expand their scope in terms of some of the campaigns that we're going to be doing. We're already planning now for expanding and building capacity in some other countries. We're also looking at ways of working in communities, and I think working in communities is really important. And so I'm hoping that Habitat will we're doing plans now for figuring out new campaigns that we would want to engage in. It's been great working with Jimmy Carter, who has, he's not going to be around forever, but he's been an inspiration to people who have worked at Habitat. I think that there's still passion there to work on housing issues. And even if we're not just building the houses, I think that there's a lot of ways to prioritize housing issues. And I think we're already seeing some new ways of working in developing countries with, we're doing more microfinance where you're doing home improvement loans versus just building the whole house and helping in that way. We've expanded to doing things on water and sanitation and latrines and various other things. So the house is not just a house. There's a lot of infrastructure. There's a lot that housing has that really feeds into a lot of other things, health and housing and education and housing, having a safe place to live. So I think there's a lot of opportunity still in the housing field. I wish they'd prioritize it more in some of these countries.
And where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Probably retired. I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. I still like to travel and my husband doesn't, so.
You've got a job that gives you a good excuse.
I know.
Travel. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Have anything else that you would like to tell our listeners?
No, I think just, you just never know where you're going, what direction you're going. I have 3 kids and a few grandkids now, and I have another grandkid on the way, or I don't know what sex, but in any case, and I think, there's a lot out there that young people should pursue. We do a lot of work here with bringing in interns and young people to work on housing and to work with as interns here as well and learn about housing and these other issues that go with it.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. Maybe you'll get a listen to the podcast and we'll want to work with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.